A golden arm tore through the lawn, snagging roots and mulch, hoisting up its body. The warden had gone 3 weeks without seeing the sky. Nothing in his programming required open air, no quirk in his developing self-consciousness lent him an inclination toward outdoor activity. Without his wife, the world above him was an annoyance at best, and at its worst a stratospheric dome of hatred by way of prejudice. How annoying that an escapee should expose him to the top layer of his world, and that it should happen today, of all days, when the lawn hosted such a noxious myriad of werewolves. As a matter of fact, the terminating robot could not make out the sky. This crowd was so thick, ever shifting, even now treading witlessly on his arm and the back of his skull, as if they were mere logs. "Guy," he moaned as his mouth hit the dirt. "No respect." Like a turtle retreating to the shell, he slumped back into the passage whence he came. Spider limbs extending backward from his spine anchored him to one wall of a dark dirt pit, a passage extending 40 feet and connecting his warden's office to the surface. Just seconds prior, Adam had plowed through the dirt with a conglomerate of drills to form this conduit. Wherever that escapee the warden called Frank was, he would do more than raise eyebrows, and the terminating robot was not even worried about him raising hell. The more conspicuous that monster, the more dramatic the warden's failings would become, the less pay he would receive, the less respect. "Oh, phooey." The golden robot mechanically sighed. "Hello, Helen," he said into his wrist communicator, and yes, a glorified wristwatch on a highly advanced roboborg did verge on the comedic. "I'm not doing this anymore." "He's free." "He's freed himself." There was no response. Not a proper one, anyway. Only the rolling roar of the crowd above, duplicated. Helen must have been on the lawn. And was that roar rising? It could not have been his imagination, he decided, because he had no imagination. Frank causing a ruckus, eh? He chuckled. Well, leave that to him. The blue dots in his skull extinguished themselves. Dirt from above trickled onto his shoulders. Seconds before, a pallid arm tore through the lawn. Strands of papyrus had ripped through first, guiding Adam by the head. The body was not only hoisted, but flung, as his wrappings became like the tails of snakes, his body balanced, and his feet dangled just above the heads of countless werewolf spectators. He was here on the surface in plain sight. Perhaps he had been overeager? Here he was, monster, looking down on the shaggy heads of normal society, and his fear was lessened. Less than before. Having been exposed to werewolves many a time, having assumed this pose of domination, and having sheer escape still foremost in his mind. "Flee!" cried his liver, and his back, and an elbow surprisingly little of him. In the process of standing and bringing him aloft, his tendrils had knocked several werewolves into one another. How small and fragile they were, and how distant seemed the chiding hand of law. And now, only now, were the citizens looking up, staring and smiling? Their signs, he could read them: welcome Flutos, peace on universe, wolves send our love, mainly 2 other wolves. Ah, so they mistook him. 3 held a cardboard cutout resembling a syringe, and yet offered the most welcoming demeanor. Others were indeed bitter, but more sulky than virulent. They yelled up to him, but the yells could not disentangle themselves from the general noise of the scene, the vast land of lawn filled to capacity and well beyond. Adam rose a little higher on the feet of the wrappings. He observed that he was around 100 feet from the front of the brown house, so the bulk of the lawn lay behind him. The crowd repeated itself, the same themes and the same ambient jostling, the interpolation of frustrated guards with their attention drawn in all directions, and the red-brown of mingling fur and sunlight like a paint stroke over them all. It was the stuff in front that gave him pause. Just before the brown house doors was something amorphously blue, gooey and succulent. It rose many feet higher than the werewolf heads, looking like a growing brain. Near it was something burning, as evidenced by snatches of smoke. Why were the citizens not fleeing? "Flee," said the liver, back, and elbow, plus a dozen other parts besides. "See what it is." "What?" said the remaining eye, shortly joined by a humble but mighty contingent. "Do not be a crazy fool," interjected an earlobe, "secure your health." "Are not you the crazy fool?" cried Hart. My body is not my mission, have you forgot that? I gave that up for dead long ago, and if, as you say, we should risk nothing in afterlife, then there is no valor in nor under heaven. The body felt scorned, yet it knew this to be true. All voices fell silent, and Adam the brave amalgam forged ahead, toward that house which remained the nexus of his mission and toward the brainy thing. There was only a little guilt to be had in slithering at speed through the crowd. His tendrils pressed wolves against each other to make way, but they pushed scarcely harder than the multitude itself. And there was no reckoning, on Adam's part, of the few guards he passed, of their troubled gazes and loaded weapons who posed no danger to him, as the case would soon prove. For the danger lay ahead in an otherworldly thing, a bulb of many mushrooms all living, whose stems became tentacles. It may well have been a flatoidon itself. And if that were the case, it made a poor show of diplomatizing it was lashing out every which way. What tentacles didn't go streaking wild-hit werewolves, wrapping around them as the main body uttered a gurgle as deep as the core of the earth. In the gurgling were words, I think, some swear it was fluto they heard, but the words, I say, and I am the authority, were, gotta get Alice to Wonderland. And those it wrapped, it plunged like knives into itself, and as it sent them to a land unknown, it seemed to swallow, and seemed to grow. No werewolves fled. They couldn't. The mushroom mass was before the brown house door. To run through the crowd was impossible, to yell for help alike impossible. Well, none of that would deter Adam, but as for the smoking thing beside it. The smoke he had glimpsed was trailing from a gutter, one that, if he chose to dip through it, would take him nowhere but to sewage and aqueous cells. He would have turned his nose up and gone straight for the door, prepared to fight through a shroomy beast, and ready above all to stake his life on the aforeproclaimed mission, had someone not risen from that sewer hole. Her eyes, of course, struck him first. Something in them remained the same no matter which form she took. In this steel shell, she was, if Adam had to say, more like herself than as a werewolf less flesh, but she had never exactly been human. She stepped out of the sewer with a sort of white tarp, lightly singed, draped over her head. This she pulled off and around herself, toga-like, and cinched around her waist. The woman he knew as Eve looked up at him with fists at her sides. And she was, if he had to say, angry. Conflict, conflicting minds in Adam's body. His nervous system became an information-seeking highway. A network of impossible questions. Should he say, hello Eve? Please let me through? Should he not make amends here and now? If he ignored her, would she pursue, and was she not a danger to the whole monster crew? And could he stand to ignore her? In this confusion of thought's profusion, he made the mistake of standing still. A cry like a falcon drowning in a swamp interrupted the scene. And a tentacle whipped in the manner of a fallen tree. It smacked Adam, it did worse than smack. He fell clear off his own tentacles, which now streamered, and onto squealing werewolves, who themselves did not know whether to help him or push him toward the beast. They shoved him away weakly, he would have fallen slowly and thudded on the ground, had Eve not appeared the next moment positioned so close, and with such an electrified fist. The First Lady went for another punch, and another for a hyperspeed flurry of punches, sped by her internal motors and their jumping circuits. But instead of punching, she seemed to slip. The blue monster was tugging her back by the ankle. Adam watched mutely. The werewolves, crying out, threw him to the ground, where he landed on his shins. The creature was taking her, perchance to ingest, and itself crying out, tumulty in hunger. What stunned Adam and made him watch was the look on Eve's face. Not frightened in the least. Not emotive in the least. There was something sure in that face, though. Simply by reading those piercing eyes, Adam realized he could divine her mission. The stillness of her face and form told of a conviction that chilled him to the bone. It told him that she had no need to struggle. She was going to free herself from the beast and come out in peak condition. And the eyes bore into him. Her real target. Not her love? Never to be her ally? He had a clear shot to the door. To Dracula. To the true companions. He was swayed, however, by unlikely hope. Traitor hope. He dove into the gutter. Above ground. Shots from the guards rang out at last. More ringing were Eve's kicks. Elbows. Piledrivers and kneebucks. And a crunching, splattering suplex. And the ghastly roar they ushered toward that dark stage of the world. The reverberations jostled the earth and shivered through Adam's body. Electric snakes. As he tumbled through this gutter 40 feet. Down a pipe. Through open pit. And into a corridor he had glimpsed in passing and in upwardly drilling. The reverberations did not stop when he hit the floor. They only changed in quality. In timbre and in source. 4 snakes were rising from underneath. These were dark halls. Deeply gray. With only the dimmest illumination winking from the walls and their holosteel alloy exterior cheap halls. Halls with the lights turned off. The floor, which trembled with a faint and constant seismism, was simply concrete. There was a guard here. Perhaps? Maybe 2. 2 lingerers who had not been dispatched to the prison below or the crowd control above. 2 mice in a veritable labyrinth. Adam could not exploit this landscape. Find a suitable position. Or even move himself upright before Eve thundered through the pipe and rolled roughly onto the floor, and with an expert change in trajectory, rolled right onto her feet. She had an aura. Radiated with vibrating, humming white. A running current. A fighting current. I am sorry, said Adam. She gave him a roundhouse kick to the skull. I have transgressed by. Proposing to you. Brawling with you. And. Now. By attempting to break into your. She shoved her boothiel into his forehead. Pushing him to the ground. And I realize we should have made formal introductions. She kicked him in the teeth. They were strong teeth. So rest assured none were broken. The roots of his gums, however, seared with a lightning ache. My name is. Kick. My name is. Kick. My God, exploded out of him. From an anger unsuppressed. Is this not excessive? We do not even know each other. Exactly, she said. With a stomp on the chest. She forced him to the concrete. The after effect of her currents raged into him. Hot maelstrom wreaking havoc on his organs. Burning through. He slowly re-rose. He stilled his mouth, despite its verve. Despite the urge to spill some intimate detail that might sway Eve's heart. That verve, he prayed, would not leave him. Nor weaken or stultify, it would crawl away from the eager palate. Walk behind the skull. And stoke itself in another pit. The jelly of an eye, and turn that liquid ball to fire of plea and passion. That verve alone would speak to Eve just as her eyes had spoken to him. Had even in metal and werewolf skein betrayed her to him. Miraculously told all. She watched him rise. Remaining still this action. 2. Miraculous. His eye was a drill on its way to her heart. That heart was found, but the drill buried too far. The drill misplaced on a sorrowful heartstring. Or the drill too violent. Boring through as if in rubble. Like the floor. She shook. Her bright hand flew to her chest as it seized. As her face contorted. As the teeth clamped. As defiance went slack. This was not the first lady he knew. And yet it was something old and striking. It was the Frankenstein's bride he knew. It was the look of terror unbound. Proof of utter agony within. It was not an agony that they shared. What Adam was feeling. His boiling panic was a separate agony, transcendent guilt, hubris, shame at his self-centered state. At his entitlement, a many-headed hydra nursed by the world which he had taken and raised himself. It was not Helen's primal fear, hers was a purely hereditary demon. That is why she alone screamed. The first fissure was too perfect. As if lightning were caught in the concrete. The impression of a bolt driven between them. Not caused by Helen's cry. And yet, what observer could help but think it so? Bolt upon bolt forked out a storm of fissures now. The walls heaved and started to split. And the ceiling began to shower rock. And Adam tore his eyes away from Helen's as the distance between them grew. As the ground parted and lurched in two directions. And he saw the place below. The pure water. And he saw the water rising. Almost graceful. Like the fold of a billowing skirt. In some possible world. He took this moment to be a hero. An alternate Adam would notice Helen's trepidation and the fact that her portion of earth was slipping below his own. He would summon his sweet papyrus. Scoop her up and away. Assuage the fears. And likely save her life. But her fear convinced him that such a rescue. Entanglement. Indebtedness to her creator. Would be the true resurrection of the Frankenstein curse, unhappiness forevermore. He felt that this was the right course of action. Albeit cruel or even suicidal. To cut the Ouroboros head. Did they truly have to die? Yes. Die. I did not jump to a rude conclusion. I did not awkwardly raise the stakes, I reported a palpable possibility swiftly turning into fact. This earthbreak was no simple revolution of fortunes. It was an inescapable death trap, inescapable. And I will prove it. Light and lightning are alike the fastest substances known to us. They would outspeed speed itself. To them, earth, water, and metal are but crude hurdles. When they bolt, what stops them? Not even the highest holosteel wall. It is when they come into contact with substances that the situation shifts. That the light becomes diffuse. Lightning stops at a metal pole, no earth was ever killed by thunderstrike. As for water, when it hits water, the results are diffusion on a deadly scale. When lightning dips its long foot in, it is bodily pulled under and its body flies apart. The entire ocean is charged. And the life, and the matter, is all undone. The concrete platform groaned into the ocean, taking Helen with it. Her life was ended, taking Adam's with it. The brown house exploded. The brown house exploded. 50,000 propane kegs worth of fireball force, set off by 1,000,000 kilowatts, burst the political power asunder. And a peal of thunder rocketed across the city, and was heard round the world, and on the moon, and a remnant even rocked neighbor Mars. Surely the aliens felt it on their journey. Surely one would hope that the Flatoidans knew to turn away at the sight and its implicit threat of destruction. That would solve our central conflict, until their next ill-fated landing. If treachery were to prevail again, were the good. A fire was there, the immoral pyre. Many civilians on the lawn had been jubilant before this moment. And their cheers were cries of victory. Of purely conditional camaraderie. Now they knew not what to say. The fire had smacked their gobs. A hot fire blazed and they stood frozen. They waited stupidly. And then it became, in a word, Armageddon. Opening wide. The earth spit its own explosions. Infernal aftershocks. Fireworks from the underworld. Some shot in the air and sparkled, most landed. And seared. And blazed. And consumed. And the people screamed. Wailed. Ran and fell into a water-fire chasm. The rising tide bore prisoners. Too. Who crawled up the cracks of hot earth. clinging like larvae to the unflared walls, and whosoever survived this flaming baptism would run. Butterflies. To the city. To reclaim life. Destroy the old. Make it in a new image. All as the mushroom creature. Beaten but not murdered. Impervious to flame. Rose cloaked in bonfire before the remains of that brown house. Before ruined riches and smoking bone. And it grew even now. And the mortifying gasp it made was the tolling bell of all things, heralding the new birth. Sending off the old. And he who had wanted to wed had not. And he who had wanted to speak had not. Lo! The words. The vows. Had to wait for another life. Here is one fact of the vampire curse that has never been made apparent. We can say that a memory is a golden coin, ignoring whether it is good or bad, it has doubtless made your fortune. Each golden coin accumulates in your store, or, no doubt it is better to say, they are stashed haphazard, in your dresser. Under your pillow. Beneath a flower bed in the park you hold most dear. Everywhere we are making valuable memories. In every place. In every livelong day. We forget. We misplace the tiny treasures. Some of us are forced to forget, some are robbed. Particularly the old and vulnerable. Others run their hand against the dresser. Smooth. Only to feel the rugged edge of a coin thereupon, to remember the time they were dashed against that dresser by a former friend unkind. Now they dash that coin away themselves, now they do all in their power to forget. The way we all forget is through death. By which point the stash is as useless to us as real gold to a pirate's skull. But the immortal, the undying, who should by rights have the greatest fortune, is preeminently forgetful. He is constantly losing track of the little coins he has dropped. Even among the crypts of his own home. As he struts through the hallway. He treads ignorant atop a shimmering road. His fortune is unmatched. It is a hoard. Yet he holds but a few coins in hand at a time. Great folly. A planet's worth of philosophy would be yours. If only you would pick up the pieces. The human head is no boundless vessel, it cannot perceive all. Nor can it contain all. It only has windows. Tiny windows. Which never exceed a few inches in width. What the vampire head retains of humanity lies in the shape of its skull and not much else. Imagine that the vampire takes a coin and, wishing to have it in mind, drops it in through a window. A slot. The mind's eye recalls. The heart's drum is pounding. The coin shoots through the slot. Only to land with a clink among its brethren. These are the memories the vampire carries with him, many of them were gained. Lost. Recalled again. And again and again and again. Why do they not stay? Look there is the reason. See that gulf. See all the coins hanging on the precipice. And see behind them the machine called time pushing forward. This is its natural emptying of the memory bank, forcing the coins to sail out of his mind no matter how he tries. This, my friends, is the coin-pushing machine of the mind. And for a vampire it is positively overloaded, there are jackpots all the time. Its scant domain is half the size of a card table. Just as it is for you or I. The more he adds, the more slide off the edge. You can try to retain memories, you can try to retain the bedrock of your very self, but your mind is a mind encased in flesh vessel. Not in a vacuum of areous ether. Did you think that a vampire's mind, being supernatural, would surpass all the bounds of nature? His flesh is still flesh. Though so wickedly catalyzed. The foundation of his brain is but a man's. Through his baptism, he made a contract for longevity. Not for wisdom, for strength of body. Not depth of body. The years lived by immortals streak by like a cosmic rain, beautiful. Repetitive. Heartbreaking. Uncountable. We dive now into a memory made ocean by rainwater. This memory. This suite of days was unremembered by the people of the 31st century. Having been a faintly curious side note to the prelude of the Second World War, unremembered. That is, except by three immortals. Each member of the triad held pieces that, like patchwork, might come together if they ever recommuned. That, however, was to prove a distant hope. Seeing as we have just seen all three obliterated in a fire cloud. Rain pattered upon the roofs of Inverness. Quite a night for two vampires to make themselves known. The senior unafraid. His junior tentative. And what a city to test their mettle, as they walked from shadow to midnight shadow. Carrying black umbrellas in their left hands and two valises apiece in their right. The judgment of 1,000 churches seemed to be upon them. With spires tall and frequent. They crossed a modernized bridge. Treading the thin border between pavement and the edge. A horseless buggy rolled by. And they were splashed. The hunchbacked lead shivered and nearly dropped his bags. But he saw that his lord was still going. And so he could not pause. Already his legs, being so short and bent, were moving in double time to keep up with a man 2 feet higher than him. Below them was the loch, which alone welcomed the rain. The waters went up and down, twinkling, like a river of keys jingled before a river of babies' faces. Igor would have preferred an inn. But Dracula, daredevil that he was, checked into the finest hotel available. It was white, chic, rigid and angular. A heap of blocks punched through with black windows. It promised the latest appliances. And the boy at the front desk talked up their complimentary ironing boards. Any breakfast? Sir? No thank you. Room service. There will be no need. I'll write that down. Sir. But if you have any problems. The maid's on duty till 2 at night. You can either knock at her door or call her using the in-suite rotary phone. Or the telegraph. Wonderful, said the Count. Twin beds. Then 1 adult and 1 child? 2 adults. 2 of the boy leaned over his desk and, at last, saw more of Igor than the top of his head. I'm so sorry, he told him. And he meant for the message to be profound. Healing. And new. The hunchback, for his part, could have yawned. Up on the 77th floor. In the 5th suite for the 7th was taken, 2 vampires swept into a bright yellow expanse. Settled down. And rejoiced to feel radiators heat the rain out of them. They swooned in the glamour of both an AM and an FM radio. Pondered the possibilities of a hairdryer. Sighed with relief at the promised phones and irons, but neither one was truly excited until he eyed the power outlet. A smile crept onto Igor's face. Rarely had he gotten the chance to combine his scientific meddling with electricity. That jagged snake tongue. Tempter from the clouds. As Vampire Senior and Vampire Junior stood beside the socket, the younger said, Count Dracula. I apologize for the vindictive sins of my heart inwardly. I cursed you for bringing me here. But I see now there was a greater purpose to all of this. Coming to this city of riches partly to suppress his trembling. He gave a most humble bow. The Count laughed aloud and rejoindered. There is no such thing as sin to a vampire. Forget your sorries. We revel now in knowledge and in labor. Way ahead of you. Count, said Igor. And he was. With a valise wide open on the now sopping bed. There were test tubes inside. And bottles. All corked. Several fizzing. As though the fluids themselves were anxious to break out. And in the side pockets were pincers. Droppers. Bunsen burners. Tiny engines. Gearboxes. Soon the full laboratory was all set up. Its operati linked by glass chutes. Metal strips. And curling cords momentarily clipped from the backs of the radios. When table and bed space ran out, the ironing board came to the rescue. And it was by such means that Dracula and Igor were surrounded by test tubes, bright as the freshest fruit. By their belches of sparks and flame. And by vital statistical papers. As the Count set a burner alight, Igor peered into the microscope beside him. "It is just as I thought," said Igor. "Not a hexagonal chain, but a double helix linking genes in a twisted ladder." "Ah. What a novelty," said Dracula. Charmed. Now that his burner was ablaze, he raised a marshmallow on a spit. Igor spun on his heels. "No. Not a novelty, a breakthrough," he cried. Frustrated with his partner, but jubilant to discover. "It shows us the layout of the genes. We can map the whole genome. We can discover whether vampire genes differ from human. And. The door opened. The maid had opened it. Though she was not supposed to have been on duty this late. Those peepers of hers saw it all. Albeit through milky cataracts. And the ears, drooping with age, could yet hear science sizzle. She was a tree of a woman. Still tough. Once mighty. Her bark crumbling. Petrifying even as she stood. Her eyes, so sunken in, seemed out of place. As if her face should have been blank and solid. As if the body should house its bird of a soul no more. The old maid said, "What is that?" They said nothing, they moved nothing. Her interruption had made each vampire rigid for different reasons. Mingled terror and curiosity swamped Igor like tremulous quicksand. But what swallowed Dracula was rage at the human's impudence. Only stifled with an effort. She said again, "What is that?" This was how the enemy dug in her feet. The opulent fiend gently pushed the ironing board aside. Stepped toward her. And with elegance suppressed the anger within. "I understand you are the maid? Listen, this is our private business. We are neither criminals nor unsavories. When we leave, everything will be back in its proper place. It will be as if we vanished." This did not convince the maid. And she became downright defiant. The Count asked her, mellowly, to look in his eyes. And she thrust her head away. As if she had known they would hypnotize. As he reached for her chin. "Count." He paused. Igor had run to his side and was pulling at his cloak. "Count." She only asked a question. "Can't we tell her the truth?" "She will not understand it anyway," he said with apparent disinterest. And reached for the maid's chin again. She snarled at him of all things. And turned herself away. "Miss," said Igor. Breathless. "We are researching genomes, that is. We are finding out the secrets of the body. Why we are born the way we're born. Why we grow sick. Why we age." She replied. "Why we look the way we look." All of a sudden, he saw her face. At least, from afar. It had seemed a face. Now that Igor saw it up close, it came alive with a rainbow of crusted color. With swirling scars delicately pink. With scabs. With permanent greens. With patches going black. With spots of down. It became more like a dead tree than ever. Pity of a kind he never dreamed he'd feel swelled in Igor's heart, a pity that assumed it knew the hardship of the downtrodden. A pity that called itself savior. This was how they found themselves taking on a new project in Inverness. It was not the climax or the start of another evaded prison sentence. But the appearance of Igor's first client. She made him a request. He clasped her withered hands. Became tearful. And promised her a few moments of normalcy before the grave. For a normal face, which a mortal vampirecy could not grant, was all she wanted. She answered with a grin that cut her face. Sprite-like. As though she had no doubt that he would do it. Not a day later. Old maid Helen was found dead in her shabby little chamber. And the handful of policemen and medics and employees who saw her remarked, rubbing their chins, "It's as if she knew." For they found her lying on top of her pallet. Even on top of the covers. Her hands folded across her chest. Well, they all concluded. It was a good death. That body, however, was a dupe. The real Helen was not in that shabby wood casket. Nor would she wish to have been. Few attended. Fewer mourned. The hotel manager came for relief. Of a sort. Since the chance to guiltlessly replace her made him giddy. Actually, she remained in that very hotel. Sequestered under Igor's bed whenever a new maid, by mistake, chanced to knock. She stayed away from the window. Ate and spoke little. And that great tree of a maiden was as meek as a mouse, often as the men worked, conversed or debated. She deliberately parked herself in the corner. In the name of politeness toward them and a fear of herself. Every day for the next 6 days. At midnight when the dark was deepest, Dracula opened the door and stole away. And Igor's new work began. He laid her on the ironing board. Gave the kiss of chloroform. Snapped on his gloves and grabbed his implements. Only after several tense minutes, when every last twitch in her body had stilled, could he pull and prod the bark. But though he knew medical rudiments, he was no trained doctor. And he could never staunch the preemptive guilt of one who has ruined another's life. Had he been too bold by taking a dive into an unknown field, would he, worse than drowning, crash into plain earth? At least this was not as arcane as gene splicery. This was the mad science of plastic surgery and, God willing, it would spare her organs if not her face. Day by day, the face transformed. Igor could not say whether it changed for the better. He stared at that bizarre, crusted swirl for hours as it shifted. Shifted. Slowly as the haze of dreams. Under his knife and picks. The closer he came to producing a shape not only human, but pleasing, the more impossible it seemed to make the final leap. As though, while his trek along the desert had but a mile to go, only at the edge of a pit could he see, it was a mile-long gap. And he was expected to leap. Then came the 7th night. The final drop of his implements on the counter. Opening of a washroom door. Wiping off sweat. Peering in the vanity. Having completed his labors, Igor, without warning, left the hotel. He struck out across the tranquil loch. Through nigh empty streets. Locked doors and cheerless windows. Lining the city were guardian hills studded with castles and churches of stone. Many fallen into disuse. It was in the doorway of such a sylvan church, garbed in moss-covered eaves, that Igor met his lord. Dracula, he panted. And the vampire superior, who had been making his exit himself, stopped. I am sorry to startle you like this. But I no longer know what I'm doing. A bat squeaked. It was within Dracula's hand. He shifted his thumb over its mouth. Igor, your guilt is natural, I suppose. But in time, this too will go. Let your failure stand as a cautionary tale. All along, Dracula had seen Helen's face metamorphose from afar, but had kept mum, never admitting to Igor that in making that gnarled face more human, he had made it still more dreadful. And now Helen was seeing that face for the first time since the surgery started. Igor had showed her to the washroom mirror. And as the light of recognition dawned in her eyes, he could not bear to witness her reaction. Therefore had he fled to his father. Now he sank to his knees in defeat. Did I fail? Yes, said Dracula, laying a bony hand on his back. But let us return and analyze this bat I carry. What about Helen? We will give her a second funeral. Of course. The idea chilled him to the bone. They moved sluggishly back into town, Dracula patting Igor's hunch intermittently in the best display of affection and sympathy he could devise. The road wound its way to the hotel, and all was empty or shrouded and still. The twin fiends were at the end of the bridge, facing the hotel, when the door opened and a guttural cry rang out. Igor stifled a shriek, his eyes watered. "Come out!" Everyone, an old woman began to chant. "Come out!" Clanging a pot and ladle together above her head. She turned and strutted down the main street. There went Helen, who had seen her new face and loved it. The lost, deluded soul. Igor fainted on the spot. "Ah. So she will summon her own funeral," decreed Dracula with a chuckle. Crowd throws rocks at apparition of old ugly maid. Agrees that said apparition is even uglier. Last night, in the vicinity of the Hotel Brute, a banshee gave townsfolk a rude awakening, as dozens of witnesses report. While she entreated onlookers to look at her beautiful, normal face, that face was anything but. And the ghost was summarily stoned. While the stones did not pass through her body, as with a run-o'-the-mill ghost, her physical description matched that of the lately deceased old maid Helen, although, according to the manager of the Brute, she was even uglier. Against all laws of nature. When the stoning proved to be too much, the haggish ghoul dove into the Loch Ness, never to be seen again, it is hoped. Thus read the headlining article of the Inverness Crier, and even centuries on. Rumors of an atrocious whale woman in the loch would sweep the globe, spawning a legend to rival Nessie. If the reporters had asked Dracula what happened on that doleful night, he would have said the same of Helen. He may have added that Igor, his liege, had run off right after fainting at the sight of her, and in scarcely believable fact, had run toward her. He, the Count, then lost track of both among the crowd. Searching the streets for nearly an hour, he could neither divine Igor's location nor Helen's, not that he had wanted the latter. Only when he returned to the hotel room did he find Igor sitting on the bed, weeping over the suitcase of science he held on his lap, which he almost cradled. If Dracula shared all of that, however, it would be highly suspicious. Igor, who had his own unique perspective, would not have spoken at all. He would keep that night zipped in the back of his throat, no matter who should ask, and thankfully, Dracula was not nosy. When he found the strength to run along the docks and find Helen, she was on the verge of leaping from a barge. The villagers had not been keen on chasing her, but only because they knew she would chase herself, diving into the sea. They figured it would be the end of her. The old woman with the baby's face set foot on the rail, but the sight of the ocean bade her pause, and a hand came gingerly onto her arm. Igor tugged lightly, and she let herself be guided. As the ship's planks groaned, he whispered, "I can make this right. I don't know how, but science will find a way." She smiled and agreed. At the time he did not know this, but really, she surrendered. Whatever he intended, it was this or death. Why not try again? Thereby she agreed to a deep, long sleep, and to a coma spent stuffed inside of Igor's valise. Do you like what you see? Ordinarily, Helen would not have been able to make out a thing in such darkness as this. Cobwebbed and near total. For many years, even seeing in light had been an ordeal, given her murksome cataracts. From today on, however, she was extraordinary. Her night vision had been rarefied. She could not see Igor's face, but discerned a smile in his voice, and thereby knew that he wanted her to celebrate. Was that the glint of white teeth in the hand mirror? She was sitting upright on the operating table, holding the mirror before herself, unsure what to make of everything. She shifted and brought her knees up below her chin. Cradling them with her free arm, some bodily sensation should have resulted. But her nerves were buried so far under metal that she could not feel a thing. That shine in the glass was not his teeth, it was something round that levitated. A ball? When Helen said nothing and seemed not to react, Igor jumped into explanation. If it's a little bit. Patchwork? That is only because I started and stopped over the course of years, well, decades. And if you can see the old face in there, then I haven't done my job. No. She could not see the old face. In fact, it seemed to her that the former Helen had been not polished, but blasted away. She turned ever so slightly, and what came into view must have been his head. She moved a hand from her legs to her mouth. Listen. This was the only way. The only solution I could figure out. Let's face facts, you were never going to be a beauty. Inverness was never going to embrace you. But at least, he wrapped his arms around her shoulders. And suddenly his whole form, Harry, lurched into mirror vision. At least there is someone here who cares about you. Perhaps not a lover, but at the very least a friend. Nobody would appreciate your company more. Helen shook violently, and the mirror slipped from her hand. It shattered across the floor, at the nexus of her facial circuit boards and right tear duct. An electric current came loose in form of blinding bolt and lashed Igor's face. He stumbled backward, she leaped from the table and screeched. And not even her screech sounded like herself. Escape, escape. She could not breathe in here, oh no. She was a robot. She could not breathe. What kind of deluded, unprofessional scientist would leave in place the capacity to cry, but not to take in and profit from air? What mishmash of nature was this? What misunderstanding of the joys of our human state? It came from one who had long been denied so many of them. From the forsaken hunchback, the vampire, the werewolf. She smashed her way out of the crypt, side-arming a concrete wall to reveal a still, tranquil office. From this heart of Dracula's castle, she rampaged unceasingly, ululating all the while, pausing for nothing, hunting only for escape. One companion was not enough, and certainly not such a one as this. One would never be enough. The yearning could ne'er be staunched. Not unless she had the world and the world had her in an endless flow of love. Eventually, she found the castle's mouth. Since Bistritz was in full flight at the time, she skydived 1,000 feet, plummeting to earth below. And because Igor papered over her escape with white lies, the master of the castle would never know. Was it she who inspired Igor's political mission? Was the war for a new world fought over the face that word 1,000 wolves? Or was Helen only one factor of many? A final domino? Henceforth, bleak thoughts entered Igor when he gazed out the windows of that castle, wondering without wonder of how a mechanical monster was faring alone. How he could have ruined her. And how this mistake, perhaps worse than fatal, could possibly be fixed. Could science unwreak what it had wrought? The brown house unexploded. Just as suddenly as it had erupted, the house was reborn. The fire stopped raging. The mushrooms ceased devouring. The grassy ground even moved to close itself. Still, the roar from the chaos was legion. 4 prisoners continued to run free, swift on the high of mild vampirism. And the lawful citizens tumbled about in confusion as if windswept. The cacophony could be heard from the top of the brown house. But it was merely a distant gale. It was not the focus of Igor's mind. Nor was Dracula. Nor was Helen. On the top of that brown house roof stood many things worthy of our attention. There was the billowing world flag. There was the news reporter Wolf, as grateful and flabbergasted as everyone in the house to have both his body and his microscopic video camera back. There was also a pretty large safe, which the reporter had given nary a glance. However, There was no Igor in sight. Not. That is. Until he opened the safe and stepped out. The president of Earth walked into the darkling air, running a hand through his head hair. He walked slowly and with his face to the sky. Dazed. In this bewildered state did he approach the on-the-spot reporter, pausing by his side. It took a moment for Animal Wolfen to turn and see him, and another to realize who he must be. He actually jumped with surprise. Wowzers. Mr. President? I never dreamed I'd see the day. Can I get in? But the president only looked up. He was watching not the skies, but the flying object therein. His eyes had landed square on the silver flutoid saucer. The aliens had resurrected the house with a healing beam, thanks to the peace cannon sticking out from the silver ship's underbelly. The brown house's flaming grave had been soaked and soothed in light and power. All smoke and all death had disappeared. Like time-lapse reversed. The brown house had risen anew. With not a hair askew. Igor gasped gently as the saucer lowered, coming for him gently as a swan. Igor's heart beat like that swan's wings. And he felt oddly light within his frame. He struggled even to stand up straight in his nervousness and excitement. He could almost sense his back hunch. The flutoidan ship moved right past him. It soared into the stratosphere. A throwing disc narrowly missed. Igor blinked. Was there a problem? But how? They had exchanged numerous communications. His government and theirs, the flutoidans, knew what he looked like. And surely they recalled their agreed-upon meeting place. Alas, can any earthling comprehend the motives and moves of aliens? Igor stood there in silence. Mr. Wolfen snapped a few pictures before shrugging and heading off to the far front edge of the roof to film the continuing carnage below. Had the camera wolf maintained a little more patience, he would have stuck around long enough to observe the coming of another. Igor assuredly observed it. Its smell was oddly burnt. Almost ozonic. A nail gun with a silver stake. This weapon he drew. Loaded. And aimed directly behind himself. Over his shoulder. Igor aimed with precision, the sight aligned with Count Dracula's chest. The president's old tussling days were not so far in the past, as he now demonstrated. Dracula came no closer. "This is not what you wanted." "Is it?" said the cautious fiend. The double entendre was not lost on Igor. Not only the sky, but the very city he had crafted now wobbled on the verge of collapse like so many tumbling toy blocks. Yet even this was not the heart of Dracula's statement. He meant the whole world. Not this mere slice, not just today, but centuries. Igor said. "It's close enough. Then I will ask you for my sake and for Adam's. For Robert Fishman. And for Trials the Witch Cat. For your former commander. Will you reverse everything I've done?" "Well, in a sense." Chick. Igor fired the nail gun. Dracula, however, had predicted this and reserved a brief snatch of vaporcraft for just such a contingency. He faded. And the nail phased through him ineffectual. "Igor," he said, re-selfifying. "We are your people too." Now Igor turned to face his old friend. Compatriot. And the closest being he had to a father. "If I am anything to you besides a president," he said, "forget me the same way I have forgotten you. You disgust me. Do you know that? I've come to realize it in the years since I left. You barely worked to understand me. As if taking me in was understanding enough." His face, once stern, began to break. "All while I struggled to keep up with you." A shiver coursed through Dracula's veins. "The years have changed me." "Huh." Igor dismissed. "Have they? I am sorry." That brought a real laugh out of Igor. An honest-to-goodness laugh. "You say that now. Can I get a bit of encouragement?" Or sympathy? You have forgotten. The scraps you tossed me now and then. Dracula. You were a cold soul sometimes. Dracula stood there inert. Dripping blood tears. Inability to understand his son or refusal? Clouds of nostalgia wafting through the mind. Or impenetrable steam bright as cataract film? A step forward and a trip back? Lies to friends to ease the stalwart mind of a hero? Silence. Now. Inert. Unable to apologize. Unqualified? Humanity approached them both like the tides of the sea approached. Then backed away, came. Then ebbed. Another curse of centuries. To go hand in hand with lost memories, lost feelings. Sunk empathy. If Igor had the higher ground, it was chiefly because Dracula's arrival had reawakened his past with such force that a tidal wave brought back the victim. A million moments of scorn add up to a tyrant. Though mingled with charity they may be. But the worst part is, said Igor. Shaking. I became something. I fancied you were helping the both of us. But you were only after yourself. You were nothing to no one. He lowered his nail gun at last. And you were fine with that until a minute ago. A minute in vampire terms. Well, I did not come to discuss the past. But that's what tends to happen when you embody the past. An interruption. Below them. Rumbles like the rolling open of 1,000 garages made the whole rooftop shudder. Igor ran toward the rear edge of the roof. Dracula turned with a swish of his ragged-edged cape. But halted. Machines were bolting out of the brown house. Not crowd-control drones to assuage the destruction on the lawn, which is just an idea. Brown house. Just putting that out there. But the Secret Service sky speeders. They would more accurately be called wheelless motorcycles. For power. Their engines combined hovercraft technology with the secret sauce enabling lightspeed, the handy and ubiquitous laser. As Igor ran to the edge, crying, "Wait! Wait! Here I am," one speeder and its SWAT rider rose before him on air blasts created by some mighty strong fans. The lightspeed component began to charge up, emitting a high-pitched whine. When he was as close as he could come without jumping, Igor said, between pants, "Take me with you." Pew pew. 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 WHHHRRR. A veritable racetrack's worth of speeders took off from the garage. From literally under their noses. Pink. Blue. Orange bolts of laser light blasted out behind the small crowd of speeders as they hurtled toward that far-gone flying saucer. Take me. My arm. Hurry. Igor stretched and reached. The rider brought her speeder closer in. Parallel with the roof. She was not sluggish. But watching the speeder pull in when a new speeder launched free with every passing moment was exasperating. Take me too, said Animal Wolfen. For his news footage of the lawn had gotten redundant. Wherever that speeder's goin'. It's the story of the century. Not to film it would be a crime. Sirs. Take me too, said Dracula. The swatter's head swiveled. The reporter took photos at lightning speed. Then there came a deafening rattle. That rider swung out a Gatling gun and pumped out 6 silver shots. She had hit a certain werewolf vampire, who collapsed and hissed most deathly into the night, and his arm bled out on the rooftop. His arm. Not his chest? But how? How could she have misfired at such close range? After the thermostat of adrenaline had lowered 1 degree. The rider saw the scene with clear eyes. On the left was the photo-snapping reporter. Equal parts spooked and determined. And on the right were 2 vampires, one evidently having saved the other. Alice removed her helmet. Dracula. Don't you want this to be over ASAP? Not with his death, said the fiend of some moral fiber. He stood over Igor. The president merely breathed. For he was still paralyzed by the gunshot panic and pain. We are not here to stage a coup. Oh. Really? Then I suppose the prisoners running out of the earth were just a side effect? Yes. Actually. The speeder rider edged forward on her craft. All right. Take him aboard. GHH as the situation dawned on Igor. He sputtered back to life when Dracula took him in his arms. At first, he reached forward to claw him only to draw back, bemused, when the senior vampire set him upright behind Alice. I presume your talk with Igor isn't over. Then, she added, we may finish on the way. I am starting to see the value of keeping him alive. If one side's going to have the moral high ground, make it us. That is not my reasoning. We must keep him alive, because he has kept his humanity alive. As Alice revved the speeder up, charging its light blast to the limit, Igor laughed aloud. Having been given what he wanted and placed in this rather villainous role, he knew no better way to react than to speak sardonically. Whatever you say, Count. As long as I touch the flatoidans, the result will be the same. Since there was no more seating room, Dracula placed a hand and foot on the side of the vehicle. And that we will not allow, he said simply. Taking off, Alice announced. Not a plank unit before that speeder jetted into Stratos. Thanks to Mr. Wolfen and his jittering camera fingers. Footage of this encounter and the odd familiarity between Igor and the Infernal would hit the airwaves later that night. When the rest of the buzz died down, if it died down, why would anyone venture to the top of the world? The fringes, of course, have supported life for centuries, humans included, but the very peak? In centuries past, the White North was a land of high adventure. Dog sledders, boot treaders, mountain climbers, hook grapplers, and their brave entourages would set out for uncharted lands. Some journeyed to map the world, others to claim some chunk of ice or land for their selfish selves. Some journeyed for personal reasons. To find meaning in life, to elude a criminal's death, and to find it. But we must recall the most famous reason of all, world peace. It was by no means a perfect plan. Toys for the good children and coal for the bad. On a single day per year? It could only have been the brainchild of a madman and a genius. By incentivizing good deeds and punishing the bad, Kris Kringle expected to nudge the Earth's people further and further into goodness. He had chosen the North Pole as his base of operations for several reasons. It was far from prying eyes and their judgment, while at the same time the magic at his disposal would give him unprecedented insight regarding the lives of others. It would force him to cut off ties with all except for a few cooperative locals. Making him the most impartial judge possible, it would remind him that life is hard. And that not only twisted hearts, but also merciless weather and starvaceous conditions can drive any among us to evil. Nothing in Kris Kringle's plan was random or spuriously chosen. Were infrequent toys not weak incentive? One might ask. Why should he refrain from appointing himself king of the world and founding a utopia based on instant gratification and instantier punishment? I would remind such a one that this is the foundation of dystopia. No. This could not be government. Mr. Kringle knew. It could not dwell in the land of adults. In jails. In courtrooms. It had to be an invisible hand. Forever unseen. Shrouded in myth. No legend, however, remains legend in perpetuity. Indeed, the map of 3001 was a veritable unchart of former lost lands recovered and made unremarkable. As early as 2027, a North Pole real estate agent planted a foot through Santa's workshop by complete accident. From that day forward, Mr. Kringle was part of the publicity machine. Without his devoted wife and elves, he never would have made it. Just the idea of commandeering his own social media never failed to make him shudder. The worst tide of modernity, however, was the rise of the werewolves. There was an unbelievable time when he was the first to preach about loving your fellow wolfman, as well as every other species of thingman, stuff person, and non-human animalcule under the sun. That was before Igor's rise. By the way, that Mr. Kringle had welcomed. At the 217th Annual International Christmas Policy Convention in the year 2304, Mr. Kringle was invited, as usual, to shake hands with world leaders. Back then, global werewolfinization was a fresh new concept. Werewolves constituted 0.0015% of the world's human population. Igor mildly suggested that Santa Claus become a werewolf to better represent the changing demographics of the planet's youth. And Santa, laughing, his belly quaking, replied, "If we all become werewolves, how will I tell all the children apart?" Many laughed, Igor did not. Just 10 years later, and Mr. Kringle's words, now a public relations blunder, were blasted again and again from the parapets, through the bugles of news and gossip. A Christmas story for the modern age. Emblem of sorrow and cynicism. How the mighty Santa Claus had fallen no sage, but purveyor of tasteless jokes. Yet they made no attempt to stop his flow of gifts and coal. They still did love him, though they chose not to admit it. Did they forgive him with compassion? Send him educational brochures about inclusive language, to help void his future words of insensitive bigotry? No. They forgave him with their greed. Those with technical know-how as to how Santa delivered his gifts began to game the system. Adults wrested wealth from the youth, or bullied the youth so that they might give to the bad. And the root of it all was this gripe with Santa's contorted anti-werewolf morals. So Christmas happened more or less as it always had. The supernatural sleigh came low to every rooftop, every chimney, every street-side cardboard box, every fire in the wilderness, to every knowable habitation wherein dwelt needy children. Many of them, innocent of their parents' issues with Santa, watched uncomprehending as protests streamed before their doorsteps, as Santa iconography was tarred and furred. Then came the year 2328, which marked the conclusion of World War IX. It was the last war before the establishment of the one world government, with all lands in reeking, smoking disarray. So much land charred, so many of the chimneys toppled. Mr. Kringle struggled to keep tabs on every earthling, despite the potency of his surveillance magic. He struggled, too, to remain composed as he faced so much death and destruction, and as he crossed the countries to watch its aftershocks unfold, and with so few to support his own self back home, beyond his wife and elves and reindeer. Worst of all, he really, truly could not tell any werewolves apart. He had made mistakes in the past, here and there. This time, however, he mistook nation for nation. When he realized the mistake, he did not apologize. He simply struck out. The torch-bearing, pitchfork-raising citizens of the world rushed his door in a siege that lasted nearly a full year. Then, in the winter of 2329, Santa lost his marbles, completely cast them to the four winds. Like a bowl full of frustration, he outright refused to give gifts this time and let animals have them instead. After all, he pointed out grimly to himself, some of them had been werewolfinized, and against their will at that. So the armies of the world sent out their bombs, which plummeted upon Santa's workshop. All his factories were wiped out in a great flash, reflected from every hanging icicle and every glacial overhang. And the polar bears mourned that day. When Mr. Kringle came to, there was nothing but white and the wind that passed like haze, harsh as it was. He was numb, feeling nothing at all. Despite being a magic man, his powers had been nigh exhausted by time and change and shuttered hearts. It took him so long to crawl to the wreckage of the workshop, to confirm that his wife and the elves were not spared. His life became utter despair. Not because of the loss of life, for such an old man makes peace with death, but because of the ghosts that began to haunt him. I am not referring to the ghosts of said wife, nor those of said elves, nor reindeer. Nor even to the metaphorical ghosts haunting all U.S. denizens of the living universe. But to the lingering ghost of a man even more depressed than Santa Claus, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge was born bitter and he died bitter. Though a product of old-timey England, he scorned Christmas nor and forever. One spirited night, one day of embracing the holiday spirit, had not been enough to change his ways. To make these greedy claws soft for 364 more. Now Mr. Kringle lived out his last days in the rotting remains of a busted-up cabin, sitting in a corner by the fireplace that never stirred. His red clothes were potato bags upon him. He wished he could starve himself and be free from tedium. And from the ghost of Scrooge sitting in the corner opposite. He was especially irritated by the 4 additional ghosts hanging over Scrooge's shoulders, those of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. Plus a man named Jacob Marley, whose thematic relevance to Scrooge's story Mr. Kringle could not ascertain. Yet Jacob Marley was the most dreadful of the ghosts. For clamped to his ankles and wrists were jangling chains. And oh, did he so love to jangle. It was every night with this guy and the North Pole. You know. Experiences 6 months straight of night skies every year. Since he had not bothered repairing his Magi-Technical Global Observatory apparati after the bombing. Mr. Kringle no longer observed anything but his slow demise. He was helped into sheer madness by Scrooge's money-related non-sequiturs and the endless attempts of past, present, and yet to come to inject Scrooge and Santa Claus with the Christmas spirit. Until one night, Marley's ghost stopped his jangle. He paused and sniffed. The same way a living mortal can smell rain. He and the other ghosts could smell a falling star, though in this case it was a flying saucer. Technically, it comes, he muttered vivaciously. So that the ghosts of the various time-linked Christmas concepts nodded sagaciously. What comes, groaned Scrooge. Better be my next paycheck. He did not laugh at all at his own clever joke. His words in the cabin were an echo far colder than snow. Mr. Kringle shivered, as he always did to hear of Scrooge's avarice. Marley's ghost sniffed again. If he knew he was smelling a speeding ghost shark approximately 5,000 kilometers distant, he would have been quite astounded. Thinking it another falling star, he said, "Oh, that one comes too." Mr. Kringle rolled his bloodshot eyes. With an effort and many pains, he shifted onto his side, cheek on the dirt. The gesticulating Christmas-time ghosts urged him to instead get up and see the sights. The twinkling stars now crossing paths with Earth's handsome sky. So, reluctantly, the man stood. He seized the one remaining windowsill, slammed his numb head against the window. Chill sweat dripped into his eyes, further obscuring the outer wastes already muddled by glass-bound frost. It seemed he had visitors, and werewolves they were not. Slow minutes passed as some kind of horde approached his door. Step by eerie step. He feared he was watching a village of new ghosts. Eager new haunters. Then they were at his door. Or the place where a door once was, that hole had been long ago divorced of it. Still the space ambassador knocked, rapping at the wall adjacent to the door hole. For he has researched Earth's customs. There came a silence. Far up and away, the moon was twinkling like shattered teeth. Mr. Kringle's first thought, as he observed that flutoidin ambassador, was that he was a Martian. For though he was in most aspects an ordinary man, an unexplainable quirky something hovered about him. Was it the placid face avuncular? Or was it merely the wire-thin antennae which wafted in the breeze? More aliens fanned out behind him. And Mr. Kringle could also descry some meters distant. Their stationed saucer. These people were Flatoidans. Dozens of them. And they came in every make and form and shape. There were Flatoidans who looked just like humans. Except with funny accessories. There was a sort of reptoid whose bulbous head had the shine of slime and the curve of a banana. There was a brownish, somehow predatory being. There were smiling bugs with rosy cheeks. And grayish people with goggle eyes. And pointy-eared kids. And slug-footed codgers. And the one they had chosen as their great ambassador was the uncular type who gestured for Mr. Kringle to calm down. Beep boop, ejected the ambassador. Take us to your leader. Mr. Kringle's throat and lips were cracked almost beyond repair. He licked his maw for several seconds before breathing. Who wants to know? In their beeping language. The Flutoid denizens blorbed to one another for a solid minute. Mr. Kringle pondered whether he should conquer this Martian and his crew, whether today's Earth was worth rescue from a distant planet's tyranny. We come in peace, said the ambassador in mechanical monotone. We seek interplanetary friendship. We were told that the leader of this globule was located in the settlement you call the NYDC. But we knew he was a decoy when we saw that he had no distinguishing features as compared to his subjects and displayed no obvious virtue. So we followed our instincts and sought Earth's true ruler where a Flatoidan ruler would dwell, at the crown of the world. Mr. Kringle understood. He was clad in regal red. He did retain humany flesh. Unlike those he had once watched. He did have an ancient gift-giving legacy. And he supposed perhaps the Flatoidans knew of this. A responsibility to Earth fully dawned on him now to keep. To protect. But not necessarily to lift up. He professed his kingship with a slight nod. And the ambassador, mimicking what customs he knew, stepped away and bowed. Then Santa Claus rasped. You must leave. Earth is not ready. The ambassador's eyes widened. Turning to his people, he said with his mouth in an unbudging O and a voice like a megaphone. Beep boop, Earth is not ready. In a distorted cacophony, they all trumpeted the same. Neighbor to neighbor. As if not believing what they had been told. And Mr. Kringle clapped his ringing ears shut. The flying saucer standing on spindle legs behind the Flatoidans opened up. And they rushed in like a gaggle of geese wearing fake tentacles. Robot parts. Wacky masks. And not actually looking like geese at all. When all were inside, the door closed in a flash. The tripod legs withdrew. And the silver plate zipped away. Just as if a giant had thrown it. The cabin was still. Mr. Kringle collapsed anew into his corner. And the ghostly rabble restarted their gabble. Marley's ghost hopped and jangled. Apparently excited by something as minor as alien invaders. Scrooge happily conceived price tags for the Flatoidan saucer. Antennae. And the probable space guns lurking in their belts. In the middle of this, the detached Mr. Kringle reflected that even those who claimed to want nothing, those single-minded aliens, wanted something out of him. That was their way of using him. Just another form of greed. Newly convinced of the vices contaminating every living creature, Saint Nick allowed his eyes to slide shut. He would sleep with his back against the wall. Right here. Nothing would stir him. Except the crack of laser gunfire. His eyes flew open at the distant hiss. And the suggestion of pain not his own. He had abided here with every intention of hermitage. Of blinding himself to violence and folly by fleeing it, only he still retained a kernel of that derned thing, sympathy. Do I hear guns? Said Scrooge. Looking about as if he had fox's ears. He told his host. Up. Man. Up. Time is money. So's guns. If we sell them. Bah. Humbug. The trading of more laser fire screamed across the ice waste. Mr. Kringle was sitting bolt straight and shaking. Caught in moral crisis. Perhaps one would think that the ghosts of Christmas past, present, And yet to come, who had once saved Scrooge from a bitter Christmas funk, would step in at this juncture. Be the angels on his shoulder, but true to their names, they only helped on Christmas. Seeing Mr. Kringle's distress, they shrugged amongst themselves. The Christmas man did what he had never dreamed of doing. Not even in his glory days, he ran out of that cabin. Though his body felt as if falling apart every trotting step of the way, his mind was elsewhere. The scrubs of boots barely sheathing his feet were the least of his troubles. And the lasers with their squelching sounds were troubling in a different sense. Troubling to his conscience only. He paused not 10 scant meters from the fighters, hidden behind a convenient snow lump. Yes. A motley medley they seemed to be, and werewolves they were not entirely. He recognized some of them on sight dimly now. But, as several of them were old, he knew them when his mind was sharper. And thus their likenesses had been burned into memory. Helen, her long history often buried under fur like so many autumn leaves, clutter of time, was shamelessly bionic now. She was out there with her lightning strut, alongside a handful of brown house agents, good as anonymous. Along with the robo-woman and her were people. There were in attendance what could be described as a fishman, a sharkman, a castle bat, a cat, and, tentatively, a man turkey bone man, with some unknown amount of Egyptian god mixed in there. And they were doing a dance of death, and shouting about their rationales. And below them were the rubbish remains of shattered moons, and so many other soldiers in fatigues. Wounded, trampled, ignored. A war. The smallest war there ever was. Between the rulers of the world nation and those who were nationless. But even so, Mr. Kringle reflected as Robert, like some dapper oceanic wrestler, raised Helen high above his head and tossed her onto rock. It was all so utterly useless. This was humanity's truth pettiness. Not greediness. Bah humbug? Not even. More like bah humdust in the wind. That is just what he said. In a half-conscious yelp he hoped would be his death rattle. Fitting that it would be incomprehensible to all but himself, just as the ways of these brats were incomprehensible to Mr. Kringle. Ho, he began derisively. And he rocked backward on his heels like a drunk. Bah humbug? More like bah humdust in the wind. He began to laugh a real laugh. But the sound caught in his throat as he plopped face first into the snow lump he was using for cover. Who dared pause or look his way? 1 second lost. And surely there went the battle. Only Jaw, who passed through the battlegrounds as a specter, would dare. He soared beyond laser sparks and straight through Adam's lunging chop, past Trial's runaway forklift and steamroller, and up for Santa Claus, not even knowing for certain who or what he really was. He rematerialized and settled beside Mr. Kringle's fainted form. Being a soldier, he knew some tools of the first aid trade. With his fins, he checked the man's temperature so cold as to remind him that survival itself at the pole was a miracle. He checked the fading pulse. Then he began CPR. Though without the exchange of breath, even though there was a living human head somewhere within Jaw's shark guts. Forcing the poor Santa dude to brave the rows of sharp teeth in a cavernous maw was not worth that trouble. None of this revived him. But Jaw knew to be patient. A startlingly warm heart hovered over Santa Claus. A welcoming space just beside the tussle over the planet's fate. Then came a tender move. Jaw lowered his head, as if bowing. And his doughboy helmet slid onto his patient. Over the classic red cap. Gasp, came Santa Claus' voice. He stirred. No more than that, he leaped, feeling instinctive joy. It was the feeling that he had received something great, a stroke of generosity. He had received something so meaningful from another. And for, possibly, No reason at all, merely because he was there. But that was only his unconscious mind feeling the love. His rational mind, once his body leaped, gripped the helmet tight, compelled him to sweat with fear. He cowered like a man at war, for were there not laser guns here? And was this not a soldier's helmet? He threw his head aloft, searching for rockets. And he sensed that in a moment, flashbacks would ensue. There was only silence. And with it the stillness. The entire monster party had paused mid-battle and turned to him, stunned, to see this act of goodwill. This must have been a stroke of inspiration for them. For it was then that the SWAT team soldiers looked at each other and asked the silent question, "What is this for?" And Helen, sore from Robert's throw, dusted herself off, only for Robert to come running back and help her to her feet. This ripple of quiet friendship would have continued its happy spread, had a shooting star not flickered in the sky and hurtled ever closer. It was the now familiar sight of the Flutoidan flying saucer. And like a benevolent buzzsaw, it whirled down to land and thumped on its tripod in a little clearing devoid of warrior werewolf bodies. Straightaway the fighters ran to the ship, all eager to give their own explanations. Mr. Kringle, still in paranoia sweep, watched this with some terror. Eyes bulging, hands fiddling with the helmet clasp. He marveled as the crowd was ejected from the door front, sent sprawling onto their backs by Adam. Yes, Adam. Not with his blood-sucking tendrils, but with a burst of pure sunlight and without even an "excuse me." He took on a regal bearing, his head became a hawk's, he was now the sun god. For who among them had a better claim to that title, master of Earth? The instant that wiggly-antenned alien ambassador set foot on the polar soil, Adam, that is. Ammonius R.A. spread his arms wide in gallant welcome and boomed. "Welcome, space deities. I see you are looking for our leader. Well, he is I, Amun R.A., god of the sun and arbiter of its rays. Might I treat you to a grand tour of this world's greatest monuments, say the pyramids of Giza?" Though none were sure whether or not the Flutoidans had strong emotions, for they did not express them in their faces and voices. Suffice to say, the ambassador was not impressed. He said softly, "That is of no interest to us. However, we thank you." Ammonius R.A. began to speak again, but the ambassador held up a hand to calmly hush him. "We have been observing you Earthlings at war for several minutes now," said the ambassador. That one, he pointed to Mr. Kringle, who was too far to hear him clearly and was near about to faint again, "feared you were not ready to meet us. We are having second thoughts." Santa Claus struggled to his forearms, then his feet, while the crowd's eyes were fixed on the Flutoidan. Those of Santa Claus flew elsewhere, directed by a distant sound. Another visitor was coming towards them, huffing and charging across the ice. His arm was wounded and his spirit remained in flux. It was Igor. Alone. Teeth grinding. Was this werewolf an enemy? Should he be stopped? Santa could not begin to answer, neither could Robert. Trials and jaw when they turned to see the president almost in their faces. "Let him through," cried another. Was that Alice? Marching in his footprints, shamelessly human? Carrying the body of Dracula over her shoulders? Had she, like the alien visitors, seen in Igor a hope-inducing glimmer? "I dunno about this," Trials meowed with concern. "Me neither," said Robert. And yet he stepped back, clearing the path. Igor strode through, nodding in brief thanks. The ambassador was standing ready. As Igor approached, his steps became lighter, his strides longer, his manner back to business. He beamed and barked. "Hello." He held out his hand, but the ambassador did not shake. "Listen. This handshake is a gift, said Igor. The handshake is a symbol of interplanetary friendship. We've been over this, and if you do not accept, we Earthlings cannot trust you. The ambassador watched him. Listen, he breathed. The truth, he sighed, is that this is no ordinary handshake. When you shake, you will realize why our humanity is so strong. And why our society is so beautiful. You will become more beautiful yourselves. The ambassador watched him. Listen, he said in almost a growl. I promised my allies that this would be done. I promised them that we'd have harmony throughout the galaxies. And if you do not shake, we will consider you untrustworthy. We will consider you enemies. The ambassador did not respond. Igor, his whole arm shaking tremendously, reached for the ambassador's hand. He never reached it. However, a far colder hand reached out from behind, taking his wrist and stilling it. Helen stepped by his side. Tell them the truth, she said. His head whirled around. That is the truth. The whole truth. They can't agree if they don't know all the terms. Igor swallowed. Listen, he re-began. The truth is, Ambassador, that my hand contains a substance that will, if you touch it, turn you into a werewolf. In several days, that same substance will initiate the serial biting disease. Thereby, you will infect your whole crew. And eventually all of your people. He was watching the ambassador's face, seeing no change. The truth is that my people do not like non-werewolves. Not just that, Helen said almost under her breath. They hate them. Now the ambassador nodded. That is enough, he said. His hand raised again. We will leave for a long time. But not for an eternity. Because tonight we have seen what makes the people of Earth great, not the idea that you are paragons of good, but the fact that on Earth, evil and sorrow, and despair, can always be reconciled. Igor's head sank. Helen looped her arms around his torso and led him away, where he had gone sullen. She brightened. Out in the crowd, people were recovering. Werewolves returned to their feet. Injured but not gone. Jaw had left to attend to Santa, who laid against his shark-hen back, sobbing and shaking but no longer so alone. Alice propped Dracula against a rock, watched him sputter back into consciousness. And the great count of the night looked at his feet then. At his sneakers. Walter's sneakers. Water pooled around the heels. Almost as if they were crying. Or as if the ice were melting with the power of heart warmth. There will always be hate, said Adam, who had reverted to less than God status. There will always be love, said Dracula. And there will always be our memories, said Robert. And look, said Alice, pointing. The northern lights. And I brought cheeseburgers. That last line made everyone, including Santa Claus, the soldiers, and every last flatoidan in the bowels of the ship, raise an eyebrow. Trials hacked out a laugh. Just kitten, she said right before summoning a huge buffet of burgers with her burglar-merger spell. A tray 15 meters across, quite enough for a spaceship's worth of people. It was fall 3001. And while change had come to NYDC, it was change that nobody had expected and few had wanted. Many things had to be explained by the Brown House. The demolition of its vast underground prison, and the subsequent freedom of its incarcerated, the proportional decrease of werewolves to none in his very own capital city. And the subsequent rise in hate crime, the degeneration and regeneration of the house itself, the revelation of alien life, followed by its abrupt, apparently anticlimactic develation. The existence of non-werewolves in space. It was not possible for the house to save face. That meant Igor took the brunt of the blame, but amazingly, the more he took, the bolder he became. Igor quietly halted future moon mining activities. saving the lunar lump from any further destruction. With no ceremony at all, he established a de-werewolfinization station in town. The first of its kind, utilizing the treatment that had been perfected long ago, but stashed away. More loudly he demanded, in a speech to the world nation that garnered more listeners than any before or since, that all species, werewolf or no, must be not only tolerated, not only respected, but beloved as fellow people. If the planet disagrees with me, I am unafraid to step down, he said, his voice echoing across seas of people with keen pointy ears. In truth, he was afraid. Deathly so. And he gulped a gulp that all, thanks to the microphone, could hear. He expected instant fury. Indeed, there was fury. But what he got, overwhelmingly, was a cool reception. Most werewolves were happy to remain werewolves. Few rioted when moon rock imports ceased. The dusty chunks had been harvested so deliriously that there would be a surplus of them for a full decade. Slowly, over the languorous course of days, those who had never enjoyed werewolfdom came out of the shadows. They came to the station in early morning when the streets were close to empty. When they left, no welcoming arms they met, but heckling, protests, and the antithesis of love. For a national policy does not equal a national truth. Then one day, a miracle happened in New York, D.C. What once had been a trickle of werewolves walking into the station became a flood. It was like watching water pass through a rarefying filter. This sudden torrent of citizens was comprised of no citizens at all. The werewolfinized animals of the city had come, as if driven by group instinct, turning in their moons, flying in the sun. One werewolf became a fluttering goose, the next a screaming chicken, a whole family of pigeons, a crowd of alley cats, little baby mice and shiny beetles. The people of D.C. were so delighted by this gleaming gallimaufry that they came to agree, variety really is the spice of life. Technically, the Brown House was a public building, constructed as it was for the public good. Dracula liked to knock at the front door anyway, and as long as many citizens remained afraid of the mythic dread vampire, it was only polite. Especially now, in the thick of spooky night. To his left, his right, and his above space, Brown House employees were dehairing the house. Not completely, they merely picked off a hair here and a hair there. The idea was to better represent the planet's demographics by matching the amount of hairs on the house to the percentage of werewolves on Earth. Dracula knocked the knocker, and a Lupin guard opened the opener. The guard smiled, gave a bow, and sent him without hesitation to the office in that famous oblong shape. Igor was expecting him. Yet when he came to that wide-open door, he saw Igor on the holophone, its image disabled, paying not a lick of attention either to the doorway or to the moon-mining progress on the screen directly above it. He was splashed across his rolling chair, anxiously bobbing a crossed leg. Dracula patiently took his seat before Igor's desk and tried not to eavesdrop too badly. No clubs, Igor said emphatically. Weapons away. Self-defense only. You'll be okay. You've got robot powers. Just keep watch and defend the public. I know we might look bad. But wait. Since when did you care about looking bad? Okay. I apologize for saying that. Uncalled for. Just keep the peace. Say hi to Lara for me. Igor hung up looking glum. When he raised his eyes to Dracula, he forced a smile. Well, Dracula, what are your demands? Was this the first thing Igor said? Not a message of welcome, but a cut to the chase. To the quick? Dracula followed along. Whatever the tone of this talk was to be, Igor would set it. The demands are as follows: refrain from werewolfening the planet flutoid. Save the moon. And he narrowed his eyes. Allow me to overthrow the government. Take it, said the president, leaning back. Happy to cede. Dracula saw the lie in him, mingled though it was with the exhaustion of recent events. Toppling the world government had never been one of Dracula's desires until Alice suggested such a thing, he knew. However, how enticing the dream of a truly free, open, and equal society was to his monstrous fellows. If anyone could make it possible, surely it was an outcast and one who remained so. One who did not, or could not, hide their hunchback. Say that Igor really was extending an invitation to claim his throne. So be it. Here lies the opportunity. Count. You have enacted the first 2 terms, Dracula determined. He did not know to what deep extent the words of First Lady Helen and former Supreme Commander and Head of Defense Alice Liddell, administered like spoons of medicine over the course of weeks, had influenced the president. It almost did not matter, so long as it was done in the name of justice. Though if I were in your stead, I would execute it all with more haste. It is a balancing act, he sighed. It's not about my popularity anymore. It's more, how do you do something without prodding the public psychology too hard? You can put a monster next door. Great. Now you have to keep them safe. You'll need legions of guards around the block. And considering what happened with our prison lately, it's a tall order. While the Brown House had been reconstructed by the flying saucer, the massive underground prison had not. Cheap, unfinished housing had been called into service, and Brown House public officials had set off hunting for more local doctors, more local jobs, to ensure more fully stocked grocers. The prison guards, too, were left without jobs, and without their subterranean homes. Their robo-bodies and dino DNA prevented them from becoming werewolves, while they were devoted to the public good and to their world nation. As long as it was a wolf world nation, they would never be considered full people. The terminating robot opted for a position as the city's police chief, which did not inspire much cheer in the populace, his new co-workers, on the other hand, took a shine to him. And among them he was affectionately dubbed the robotic cop. A suspecting snarl remained in Dracula's chest. A snarl benevolent, wishing that Igor would move more quickly, with a fierce ambition that he was not doing enough. Yet, it seemed quite something that every prisoner had gone free, and that no future trial awaited them. Quietly like a mouse in the rafters, Igor had removed not a werewolf from the dockets of crime. If Dracula had one concrete, verifiable sticking point, it was Igor's term limit. Tell me about your presidency, he said. It's over. Either next year, or next election cycle in 3004. Alice talked me out of it. Dracula's eyebrow jimmied. So you two do talk? We do. On occasion. And I wish she would run. We need a strong contender to go up against Dan. My knowledge of Earth politics has grown spotty as of late. Who is this Dan? Oh. You don't know? Igor chucked, not a winsome chuckle, but a chuckle that feared justice's loss. I used to have a political apprentice. We were going to prop him up as a hero, then a senator. Now he is the face of werewolf rights, really a misnomer. It should be only werewolf rights. And he is campaigning already. He grinned. Anyone who hates me is for him. But you have more allies than you know. There were no terms left to discuss, their topics of news had waned. I'm sorry I ignored you. Dracula. Not just now, but for the past eternity. He leaned forward, hands folded on the desktop. From now on, this house is your house as long as I'm in it. I only wish you didn't have to watch yourself in my streets. Slinking through side streets was second nature to him. And, in truth, He did not mind it. For such a man of the night, the gift of Igor's home was more than enough. "And I on my own behalf apologize," said Dracula, a bony hand across his chest. "I have been unkind to you. And before bringing myself to your door, I should have taken greater pains to understand you." "How is Adam?" Igor managed to say, though the moment, "as you know," was heavy. Grimace of regret. A pain swept over Dracula. "Believe me, I am gladdened and surprised to hear you ask that," he replied. "Through my own inaction, I lost contact with him. After our big burger meal at the North Pole, all in my squad parted ways. Trials returned to Stonehenge, Robert to the Galapagos, Alice with Jaw to find a new home somewhere aboard this wide and wonderful planet. And while I made plans to reconvene with you, I prepared to ride Bistritz anew. Adam, however, did not even take a speeder back to solid, non-icicle land. Instead, he elected to walk toward, of all places, Siberia. He remembered the night. How could he not? In a drizzle of gold and snow it showered upon him, and the coins of reminiscence gleamed in his eye again. Cold fields made warm by burgers and angels and the hearts of those he knew, and perhaps, in this flux future, could still better come to know. He remembered seeing Adam in the scanty clothes of a prisoner, lacking his hat, one eye replaced with a pit of many fathoms. He remembered the cheer aboard that face. It had struck him as the cheer of a man about to die, without anyone knowing just why he was smiling. The man amalgam trudged on through the wastes. One parting wave, and then his figure was shrouded in snow. Instead of inquiring as to his plans, "I figured it was better not to say anything," Dracula admitted. "At the time, I assumed he preferred the silence. Now I wonder if I had been cold again." Igor said, "You can't be hard on yourself for these things." Was there a right answer? "The right answer," said the Count with a shiver, "was not leaving him to die. Here he is. I found him." "What?" "His number. I looked it up." The proof was in Igor's hand, a hologramic holophone directory. "What? Oh." Igor snapped his fingers. "I thought I knew him from somewhere." Dracula's pupils shone with twin furnace-ant blazes. "Then we must call him." Igor laughed aloud again, a full-faced guffaw. "You can try. Somehow I doubt he's going to be free for quite a while. But when he is, the party-planning fiend determined, there will be a night or at least a conversation to remember." It was Christmas in the year of 3005. Synthetic snow chopped through the skies of Las Vegas, twinkled past neon signs and a gaudiness that had neither faltered nor improved in over a millennium. Up and down the boardwalk went sad gamblers, honeymooners, town clowners, bucket listers, and impersonators of celebrities of the distant and not-so-distant past. For the first time in what seemed an eternity, a few of those street-steppers lacked dog ears. In this transitional age, yesterday's monster was today's celebrity. Perhaps someday the pendulum of passionate hatred and patronizing love would cease its swing and settle in the middle over a point of understanding. Until then, Trials would ride the wave of fame. She was one of 3 acts in a carnivalesque variety show. After the trapeze and a dancing ape-man, there was her role, and as they were not yet sure how to take advantage of her magical abilities, they had her pretend to be the wisecracking puppet on someone's lap. "What are you?" "Kitten me," she said, to packed houses and to the tune of $5 billion a night, in future dollars. So not very much. But she's a cat. She doesn't have rent to pay. Tonight she went wandering the Vegas Strip, as she was wont to do. She knew better than to go out strolling as a black cat. So, using the tabby-babby-crabby spell, she changed the colors of her fur. She took a break under a roof of flashing bulbs, Under the message: new vaudeville ape dude. Tightrope dancing. Jokes and funnies with the amazing cat. Squinting through Vegas legs. She watched the cars pass and the feet step off. Here came a familiar pair of stack heels. Trials liked knowing her fans. And was enchanted to know that this particular fan had come for the 27th time. And here was another familiar sight, pinstripe pants and daring suede shoes. But whose? If only she could see above the shins. Then she would recognize the wearer right off. Wait, what's this? As the car door behind those legs opened all the way, it released a blast of salt water. The crowd shrieked. Trials skittered and jumped out of the way. The water merely grazed her tail. Now, instead of exhaust, a new, sweet-smelling breeze hung in the air, an island breeze. Rejoice, Trials, for here is an old friend. The crowd, disturbed by the salty tide, parted for Robert. Trials trotted just behind his heels. Unperturbed, the fishman walked up to the ticket booth, his pipe bubbling with a low gurgle. Once he had made his purchase and asked whether he could see the stars up close. Rejected. Trials got his attention with a thumb-lump-tum spell, which nicked him in the neck and bounced away. Robert whirled, ready to see a heckler. Instead, he found the cattiest cat to ever cat. A patterned tabby, sitting sweetly. "What brings you here?" she asked. "I hope that's a rhetorical question." "Been a while." "Trials, I wanted to surprise you. But we should have known it's not so easy getting something past you. So it's a whole surprise party just for me." "Did I say we?" "I meant." Robert gave up with a shrug and a grin. "You got us hook, line, and sinker." He fished out a card more fitting for Halloween than for Christmas, decorated as it was with orange bats and green-eyed cats, and handed it to Trials, who caught it between her round forepaws. Dracula didn't share a guest list. But when he throws a party, it's go big or go home. Meow. The party was to start directly after the show. Robert sat patiently in the back rows of the act, not exactly enjoying anything on display, but more than willing to support a companion. He did notice, with a little satisfaction, that this carnival act did not treat its members as mockable freaks. Though the ape man was labeled as simply an ape man, and not, say, Elroy Ape Man. He was lauded for his skills, not poked and prodded for his looks. When the gorilla did his dance, even the jaded Robert got to clapping in the name of societal progress. At the end came Trials and her master, while the werewolf who held her on his lap glugged water. Trials quipped, "Water you? Kitten me?" The crowd rejoiced, but Robert shook his head. He could have written a multitudinous critical essay about the complicated social issues inherent in this show. They were interrupted, just as an attendant set a potted plant in front of the performers, presumably so that Trials could repeat "water you, kitten me" while pointing a paw at the plant. There pealed a ringing of bells, the sound and essence of powdered snow. All on stage stopped, their heads and opposable ears swiveled. A chill went through the audience, but 'twould become a festive chill, for 'twas the season. After all, ever since the ignominious desertion of Santa Claus, people had given each other presents on this day, hoping to forget, but never to forgive, the jolly man who had forsaken them for frankly random animals. Thereby some festivity remained in the winter holiday. This, however, was the site of the Christmas Revolution. In a quick blaze of polar vortex action, there on the stage materialized a hearty, healthy Santa Claus and his open sleigh, complete with 8 reindeer. Now, together with the ringing bells were gasps and the sounds of delirious fainters, those whose past experience with magic was purely sleight of hand. Trials' assistant was bluntly terrified. And he, too, fainted outright, forcing the feline to drag him off stage by the collar. This was just as well, for it gave the 24 elves ample room to spread out. Short people in green caps and stockings scurried out of his sleigh, bearing gifts in bowie cubes, tossing and kicking them to an audience that knew not what to say, if it was even conscious. Those who caught and opened their gifts, however, were bewildered in the good way, for the gifts were magnificent. All the while, the reindeer's saddle-bound amps pumped out a holiday-themed bopper, its vocals sung by a gyrating Saint Nick. By the time the new vaudeville showrunners had finally yanked him, his sleigh, and every individual elf away via comically long hooked canes, the audience had really come around. While the first impression had been lukewarm, applause now came like a hailstorm. Robert, for his part, gave a standing ovation. Santa's comeback had gone more smoothly than he expected. Afterward, Robert met Trials out back, caught up with Santa, hopped in the sleigh, and they were off sailing high in the sky, far from the madding lights. The magic reindeer, trotting on sheer air, swirled in epic arcs before banking on Bistrit's prow. I do not know where on a Castlebat's body the prow would be. They had arrived in Bistrit's everlasting night, on a mossy castle porch, and the reindeer fed from a trough of grass and curds. And then, gracious guests, cried Dracula, who all but swooped up to the front door as soon as Trials pawed the door. He looked peculiarly radiant despite being in full possession of vampiric powers and the sickish pallor they brought. Perhaps the mere presence of friends gave him life, which, if true, would make him the truest extrovert of all. He embraced Robert, then Santa, then kneeled before Trials and shook her kitty cat forepaw. Fast enough to get the ball rolling but slow enough to permit relaxation. This perfect host Dracula showed his guests to the drawing room they all found so familiar. Robert and Trials thanks to their misadventures, and Mr. Kringle thanks to many madcap antics which ensued prior to the tale you now read, in which Dracula crossed paths with eminent figures from around the known world, though not the known universe. Already waiting for them, reclined on a sofa, were Jaw and Alice. The former had decided to remain in his werewolf form, for all the disgust it had initially engendered in him. He had come to like it for its convenience. The latter found her human form an existential relief. Her shade sat in her V-neck, half hidden by her blazer. The instant they stepped through the door, Jaw had them in his sights. Eagerly, even hungrily, he leapt to his feet and in a handshake snared Santa Claus. Santa. Santa. The big daddy of Christmas. I'm such a fan. I never got the chance to tell you. Oh, keep the helmet. Consider it yours. Ho ho ho, rejoined Santa, equally surprised and delighted. What's all this? We had better sit down, said Dracula, for he felt a story coming. Everyone gathered around the fireplace and devoted their complete and utter ears to Jaw, even Trials, who not long ago had totally ignored a tale in the same space. My gratitude to Christmas runs deep, he regaled. I was just a boy when the big war started. I thought you fought in that war, said Robert, a hand on his pipe. Not that big war. The other big war. My parents. They were vacationing in Europe at the time. Got the best hotel for miles around. Only reason they could afford rooms is on account of the location. Matter of fact, the big war was on our hotel's doorstep. Not a day went by without bombs soaring precariously close to our hotel room window. I didn't understand what any of it meant, I just liked bombs. I thought it was all gee willikers cool. My parents tried to keep me inside, but I just couldn't stay cooped up. Couldn't be tamed. It's like I had a little shark in me even then. Well, one night I ran out the door. Actually, I ran out the window. Because we weren't on the ground floor, point is I ran out some opening. And I landed on the ground. And I ran. And ran. And I ended up on the front lines, which were alive with gunfire. My parents screamed for me. No. Petey. Don't. Don't run headlong into the big war. The minute I got on those front lines, the clock tower of that wonderful hotel 12 feet away struck midnight. Guess what? It was Christmas. Not only that, it was the famous Christmas they make movie flicks about with the Christmas truce. You may recognize me as a character in those flicks, the Christmas truce baby. Santa's eyes watered with new recognition. The very same? The very same, Jaw said proudly. When I got there and the clock bell tolled, all the shots stopped firing. In fact, any shells that had escaped their barrels just before the bell seemed to fly backward. Back in. Bombs in mid-explosion? They faded. All those soldiers at each other's throats? Their hands fell from their necks to their fingers and they shook on it. Then, seeing me, the lieutenant on duty ran up to me, tousled my hair, and stuck his doughboy helmet on my head. He told me, "Have yourself a happy." We may never know his name, Jaw said with a melancholy smile. But we will always remember the good that simple act did. Oh, said Santa. That was Lieutenant Philip Lumiere. Oh, said Jaw. Well, to be honest, I wasn't that interested in knowing. Well, you implied that you. That is quite all right. You too, said Dracula with placating gestures. Santa Claus has lived at the top of the world in relative isolation for longer than most of us have been in existence. His social skills have something to be desired. Hey! Santa Claus did not say, he not only agreed, but also could not neglect his festive Christmas ghouls nor his less festive old man ghosts who continued to haunt him on lonely nights. He still meant to find a therapist. Trials butted in. Hey! That was heartwarming and all I mean. Before the antisocial ending, which was total catsup, but where'd the elves come from when you completely trashed my new vaudeville act? Potentially ruining my career? Nobody could tell whether or not she was upset over said career ruination. Oh. Those elves? They're clones. Don't tell me you got a clone Mrs. Claus too. No. That one's an original. Dracula was happy to explain. Mrs. Claus had not been an irradiated corpse for centuries. She had been launched elsewhere on the pole. Far. Far away from her spouse. And while she was in constant pain, and eventually locked in the center of an iceberg, they reunited last January. Wow, cried Jaw, clapping. Lucky man. Soon after Jaw's saga ended, Robert turned his attention to Alice. Each one was sitting at the end of a sofa, close enough to touch the crinkling fire. Good to see you. Alice. What's up in the world? If you don't mind me asking? Well, for starters, I'm Mayor Alice, she said. And a smile briefly twitched on her face. Really? How is that? I had been avoiding social interactions in my work for a long time. On the rare occasion I came out from behind my desk, I was screaming at an army of hounds too afraid of Wonderland to look me in the eye. This, I think, is the job for me. Though, maybe it is an illusion. The idea that I can get on even ground with the people of Stone's Throw, I see the illusion as a challenge. And that challenge, she added, flexing her wrists, is an engaging conundrum to beat. Robert pursed his lips in momentary meditation. I'm glad to hear that, he said. The world needs fearless, adaptable leaders like you. But I'm concerned about your health, you know. Your sanity. About Wonderland? She actually laughed aloud then. They gave up on me, so to speak. What happened is, I changed my tactics. Back when I was preparing my mayor's office, I set up a tea party in the yard. Perhaps instead of avoiding the Wonderlanders until they became grotesque super beings. I was better off making myself a clear target. Sounds very unlike you. Keep in mind, I had traps and cages ready to go. I was terribly frightened. Really. However, when the Wonderland folk started to appear and saw me refusing to budge and putting my foot down, strangely they didn't yank me back into their hell, most of them stayed for tea. Stone's throw. England, though a small town of the 31st century, would in former times have been called a megapolis. It was small enough to captivate her. Her former home was gone forever. But there still remained the wind, the weather, even the sorts of trees and honeysuckles through which she ambled in her youth. Slowly its population of werewolves was falling, that was nothing new. What rose were humans, wildlife, and foreigners, tourists and immigrants from another plane. With a chorus of technological cheeps and chips. Dracula's cellular phone interrupted. All heads swung like switchblades as he leaped to his feet and made for the captain's quarters. He cried. Everyone remain in here. No need for alarm. No need. Of course. He did not explain what the hubbub was about. He sprinted off. And the group noticed he was wearing Walter Whipple's shoes. Nowadays he wore the Walters on special occasions, what society called fancy spats. He wore on errands or whilst shuffling about the house. Mighty wing beats signaled that their bat was descending. Landing. The beats reverberated through the house, making the visitors all aquiver. A grand thump brought them to land specifically to a dock on the coast of Croatia, not that they could see it. Lacking, as they did, a window. Not long afterward, a breathless Dracula re-entered the drawing room, along with a man in a smart suit to rival Robert's. It was Adam. A long-gone hero. Instead of his canicular hat, he wore aboard his head a pharaoh's striped headdress, and on his chin a goatee swathed in a golden wrap. One eye hole was sealed with a deep red eye patch, the other with veiny white and pupil gold, bright enough to rival the fire. The crowd shook hands, touched shoulders, politely rubbed, that was Trials the cat with his shin. They licked and lathered, which was also Trials. And then all were gabbing about the rumors they had heard about his affairs ever since, and the travails he had weathered. And Dracula showed them to the dining room, for all guests were now assembled. And the clone elves, who had taken their fill just earlier, stood by the hearth playing lounge music. As the party entered, Adam mumbled to Dracula. Such cordiality requires a response of equal politeness. And yet I cannot possibly rise to the task. Forgive me, for I have only 15 minutes before my next work-related appointment. Dracula swatted the air. We will manage. At my post in Siberia. Now the Count began to worry. He cracked his captain's knuckles. I thought you only worked in West Europe. I wonder where in the world you heard that, said Adam lightly. He might have said where in the universe and been more accurate. But few knew just how far Dracula's more recent travels had taken him. With a flash of his cape, Dracula marched up to the night window and the wooden wheel. Adam decided he would rather spend these 15 minutes chatting with his friend and savior than eating familiar foods he had long since supped upon. The other guests, who followed, seemed to agree. So they crowded the deck, holding party platters of funny-shaped cheeses and daintied fruits. And as Bistritz whirled onto a wild new course almost rolling into the brightish evening, Adam rolled through his QA. 43 positions? Just 42, Adam said to Robert. The world government and I agree that it would be unfair to have the likes of me/us serving in a single municipal post, as my body parts maintain separate consciousness. Ammonius R.A., however, is not suited to serve in any of the world's governments. He does monitor the rising and setting of the sun, though, and it does not always rise on time. To my surprise and yours. Interesting, said Robert with a nod. This may be poor wording on my part. And maybe I'm not thinking from the right place, but how does it feel to be working with people who mistreated you for so long? For the enemy? It is. Adam took a deep breath and a sigh. Complicated. And yet, it is all I ever hoped for. There is more gratitude than one would expect. Robert smiled. Are you running? Said Dracula. From what? Oh, the presidency. That. No. I have no thought of that, it would be unfair. You see. Robert should run. Ah. No. Robert cried, but even those rock-hard scales could not hide the bashful blush. You know, Dracula exclaimed. I never cease to be impressed by you. You are a strange kind of vampire. One who deals in darkness and in light. And not only that, you devote yourself to helping people everywhere, humans. No less. Whereas I am some sort of playboy vagabond. Adam replied. Would a simpleton have freed me? No, would he have freed 2 planets? Their talk fell to a lull, but a happy lull. A lull of agreement. Of perfect sympathy. Oh me, oh my, Adam said in nearly a whisper. I nearly forgot. I have so much going on. You see. Dracula twitched. What do you need? Your help. Perhaps? In the coming days, but let me begin at the beginning. And end with my all too hasty drop into Siberia. 1 week ago, or was it 2? I stopped Helen as we were leaving a constitutional convention. Wolf whistled and the rest, with their critical stares, straightway admonished him. My love for her has faded, Adam said reflexively. And it is not a matter of either of us being at fault. Indeed. If anyone should be to blame, it is I. For I believed she had to be mine. Our lives took us on separate paths, and we drifted. Time graced us each with truer friends. And each of us is better for it. The love I had for her is but a memory, and even that was a fantasy. Had no chance. For it was so thoroughly inorganic. Naturally. We do not keep in touch. I accosted her. However. Because I thought she might have some score to settle with Victor Frankenstein. I certainly had mine. For the first time in a while. Santa spoke. My magical observatory may not be in peak condition just yet. But I know for a fact that that man is no longer living. Dracula murmured. He means to cross over. I mean to cross over. Adam echoed most grandiosely. Ammoniusare has contacts in the land of the dead. If he can negotiate with Anubis. Pull a string here and there. Why, I might be able to close the book of my tortured origin once and for all. What would he say to such a man as Victor? Questions revolved in the party's minds. None believed that he would speak barbs of vengeance, but whether Dr. Frankenstein would fire his own was another story. To say nothing of Helen's response, she had never met the doctor. Is Helen joining you? Dracula queried. She would at least be a powerful ally. For even for gods, there are archlords to watch in the depths of the afterlife. No, Adam said. But she did wish me the best. Call me when you go, said the Count warmly. And if I cannot make it? Suddenly the bat rocked. Had they hit a temporary gust of turbulence? Not quite, they were right above Siberia. Caught in a strangely unforeseen wintercal storm. The cabin reeled. And the snow buffeted them such that hardly a word they spoke could be deciphered. Still Adam, who scrambled down the hall in search of the emergency exit hatch, managed to hear. Take the shoes. He had entered the dark of one of many cellars when another voice, almost ghostly with distance, added. And the dresses. The dresses? Had Adam heard that correctly? Though he was a fiend with so much friendship to share, there remained parts of his own tangled past that Dracula was fain to broach. If Adam gave it time, as Adam was glad to do. Such sad memories would lose their sting. And flower. The result. A felicitous garden. Would bloom for lifetimes. Its tenderness truer than any book. The vortex below Bistritz was harmless to Adam. He was numb to ice. Untouched by fire. But people he could feel. He fell like a diver without a parachute. To land on welcome snow.